She sat directly across from me at the long, polished expanse of my mahogany dining table. Her poise carefully measured, every motion of her hand or tilt of her head deliberate, calculated. Her posture was impeccable, her manner so composed it bordered on theatrical. She was the very picture of elegance, a woman comfortable in her skin, confident in the belief that she had the upper hand. The room was warm, with a low hum of conversation and clinking glasses, but between us stretched a quiet, invisible tension. Her red lips curled slightly as she offered a compliment on the ceramic centerpiece I had arranged myself hours earlier. It seemed gracious on the surface, but underneath her words was something else entirely, an insinuation. She wasn't complimenting the decor, she was claiming the space. Rachel Montgomery believed she'd won. She believed the seat she occupied at the head of the social table and the unspoken intimacy she shared with my husband was a secret well kept. What she didn't realize was that within 38 minutes, her illusion would fracture like glass under pressure. Her confident smirk, her polite inquiries, her sideways glances at James, they were all being watched, analyzed, documented, because at precisely that moment, her husband, Dr. Michael Montgomery, stood outside my home, bouquet in hand, unaware he was about to witness the unraveling of his wife's carefully crafted deception. I had orchestrated everything: the menu, the wine pairings, the playlist softly playing in the background, the careful balance of guests drawn from mutual circles. This was no spontaneous dinner party. It was a symphony of subtle exposure, composed with the meticulous attention to detail I'd honed over years in my career. There would be no confrontations over cocktails, no shouting matches in the hallway, just the truth laid bare in the most civilized way possible, the kind of unveiling that didn't require theatrics, just evidence and opportunity. This isn't a story about infidelity, not really. It's about betrayal disguised as friendship. It's about the erosion of trust beneath a polished surface, the quiet disintegration of something once believed to be solid. I had been blind for a time, but once I truly opened my eyes, there was no unseeing it. My name is Victoria Ashford. I'm 34 years old, and I've built a reputation as one of the most tenacious forensic accountants at Patan and Associates. My specialty is dismantling deception, following financial trails through complex networks of shell companies and offshore accounts. I thrive in silence, in shadows, in the quiet spaces where truth hides. I know how to trace anomalies, how to untangle patterns that don't add up. What I never expected was to apply those skills to my own marriage. Ooh. My husband, James Ashford, was a respected orthopedic surgeon. Our life from the outside was pristine. We lived in a beautiful home in one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the state. We hosted lavish dinners, traveled to Europe in the summer, donated generously to local charities. We were the power couple everyone envied. I believed we were solid, unshakable. But it turns out you can be married to someone for over a decade and still not see who they truly are. It started with small things, subtle shifts in behavior, missed calls, late nights, excuses that didn't align. My instincts prickled, but I resisted the urge to doubt. I chalked it up to work stress, to exhaustion, until one day a dinner receipt from a hotel restaurant slipped out of his coat pocket. 2 entrees, 1 bottle of wine, a room charge, and the date matched a night he'd claimed to be in surgery. That's when I began collecting evidence. Quietly, methodically, the way I'd approach any investigation. Over the course of 16 weeks, I traced every interaction, every meeting, every lie. I confirmed what I already knew in my gut. James was having an affair. And not just any affair. He was entangled with Rachel Montgomery, the woman now seated in my home, sipping wine and laughing as if she hadn't been systematically dismantling my life. She was careful. I'll give her that. She chose her moments with precision. She'd join us for dinner parties, chat easily with our friends, offer to help in the kitchen. She played the role of confidant so well that for a time, even I liked her. But underneath that polished exterior was a predator, targeting with a smile and a glass of Merlot. Rachel had no idea that every move she'd made over the last 4 months was being watched. She had no inkling that I'd hired a private investigator, someone discreet and thorough, to document her every encounter with James. She didn't know that tonight, the very wine she was drinking was paid for with the same credit card James used to book their most recent hotel stay. Nor did she realize that the USB drive hidden beneath the napkin rings held enough evidence to not only ruin her marriage, but publicly disgrace her in front of every person she admired. Outside, Michael waited patiently, his arms filled with flowers and hope. He thought this was a surprise anniversary dinner, thoughtful collaboration between friends. What he didn't know was that tonight he'd see his wife in a way he never imagined. He'd see her through my eyes. And when he did, everything would change. His trust would collapse, his perception would crumble, and his world would split in two. This night was not a plea for sympathy. It was a demonstration, a declaration, a meticulously planned event where the truth would be delivered not with fury, but with precision. Because that's who I am. I don't explode, I reveal. And what I had to reveal tonight would leave no room for denial. And so I sat still, my expression serene, my demeanor composed, knowing that every smile she gave, every delicate brush of her fingers against the stem of her wine glass, would be the last she'd offer in ignorance. She thought she was admired tonight, that the glances around the room confirmed her social elevation, but in reality, she was being observed as one might watch the final flicker of a candle just before the wick burns out. She had stolen something sacred, trust, loyalty, and dignity, and believed there would be no cost. But everything has a cost, and hers was about to be tallied. The guests around the table shared polite laughter, unaware they were seated in the middle of a social powder keg. Every comment, every toast was edging us closer to the moment of collapse. I'd handpicked these people not just for their social standing, but for their insight. There were lawyers, doctors, a journalist with a penchant for scandals, and two old friends who'd seen both Rachel and me through different seasons of life. They would not look away when the truth came out. They would not excuse what was coming. They would witness it and remember it. My hands were steady as I adjusted the napkin in my lap. My voice, when I spoke, was warm, inviting. I played my part as host effortlessly because it had always been mine. Rachel had borrowed a costume in this play, thinking she'd claim the role. But she hadn't read the script I wrote in secret, rehearsed every night in the silence James left behind. Her curtain call was coming, and unlike any she had faced, it wouldn't end with applause. Beloved wife. That's what he thought she was. That's who he believed he was coming home to. A woman worthy of celebration, a partner who deserved roses and affection and whispered declarations of love. Michael had no idea that the truth was waiting just beyond the threshold, layered under fine wine and candlelight. He would soon discover that his carefully curated world, his devotion, and every assumption he'd clung to for years were all founded on lies, spun in the shadows of our lives. Rachel laughed again, tilting her head just slightly to offer James a smile so practiced it looked spontaneous. My fingers tightened around the base of my wine glass, but my expression never faltered. I wasn't going to allow her the pleasure of knowing she had struck any chord. I would not offer her even a flicker of the turmoil she had ignited. This evening was my chessboard, and I had already set the pieces. She was merely playing a role I had scripted for her. James, for his part, was playing the doting husband flawlessly, his voice carried with practiced charm, telling stories that earned polite chuckles from our guests. He held her gaze just a second too long, poured her wine without being asked, brushed her shoulder as he passed. It was all so subtle, so effortlessly woven into the rhythm of the evening that no one else seemed to notice. No one, except me, because I had learned to watch the silence between the words, to listen to the things people didn't say. I had spent countless nights retracing our past, trying to locate the fracture point. When had Rachel begun to see my husband not as a friend's spouse, but as an opportunity? Was it that spring dinner party we hosted on the veranda? Or the weekend fundraiser at the Coastal Inn? There had been so many intersections, so many moments of proximity cloaked in civility. But now, every handshake, every laugh, every shared glance felt retroactively stained, like clues I had missed in plain sight. Michael's arrival would be the turning point. I had instructed him to come exactly 1 hour after dinner began, under the pretense of a surprise entrance. He was eager to please, romantic in the way men who believe they've found their forever tend to be. I had told him I was helping Rachel plan an intimate toast to their love. I had even suggested he write a letter, something heartfelt. And he had, the envelope was now nestled beneath his bouquet, addressed to my heart, my home. Rachel had no idea, and that was the delicious cruelty of it all. She thought tonight was about her triumph, her ascendancy, her place at my table and in my bed. She thought she'd been clever, that her manipulations were invisible, her secrets secure. But I had seen them. I had chronicled them with the obsessive thoroughness of a woman whose heart had been torn apart and stitched back together with threads of righteous fury. Each guest at our table had been chosen not just for their social relevance, but for their connection to Rachel and James. These weren't strangers, they were allies, coworkers, old friends, witnesses to what was and soon what would never be again. One couple had vacationed with us in Provence. Another had been at our wedding. I wanted every gasp, every glance, every awkward silence to be shared by those who knew them best. When the photos played, when the receipts were read, when the hotel room booking was cross-referenced with Rachel's calendar, there would be no room left for doubt. Only the truth, laid out plainly and brutally. The first course arrived, saffron risotto with seared scallops, and the mood around the table was light, even joyful. Rachel complimented the chef, unaware that the man in the kitchen had been paid extra to delay service if I gave the signal. Every detail was part of the design. Every variable accounted for. The timing mattered. Michael would walk in just as dessert was being served, when everyone would be relaxed, their defenses lowered, when Rachel would be leaning in close to James, perhaps laughing at something only they understood. That would be the moment I triggered the reveal. I'd rehearsed what I would say. Something calm, something measured. I didn't want to scream. I didn't want to cry. I wanted to narrate, to walk everyone through the evidence like a tour guide unveiling a dark gallery. This, I would begin, is the receipt from the Westland Inn, April 6th. Notice the timestamp, 8:43 p.m. That same evening, Rachel told Michael she was attending a book club. Then I would let the silence stretch, let the weight of the lie sink into the room. James would shift. Rachel's smile would falter. Michael, poor Michael, would begin to connect the dots, slowly, painfully. And the others would sit frozen, forks midway to their mouths, unsure if they should look away or look closer. It would be theatrical in its quiet devastation. And I would remain seated, composed, the image of a woman finally reclaiming her voice. But the truth is, I wasn't just doing this for myself. I was doing it for every woman who had ever been made to question her instincts, for every wife told she was imagining things, every partner gaslit into silence. This wasn't just vengeance, it was vindication. And I would not let it slip through my fingers. Rachel reached for her glass, her fingers brushing James's as he did the same. They laughed at the contact, and I saw it. That flicker in her eyes, the one that said she thought she had won. She thought she was untouchable. But that was the tragedy of people like Rachel. They believed their charm was armor. They mistook secrecy for safety. I glanced at the clock above the fireplace. 21 minutes to go. The conversation shifted toward travel. and someone asked James about our last trip to Paris. He stumbled slightly, then recovered, but I caught it. The half-second pause, the flicker of uncertainty. He hadn't been in Paris with me. That trip was supposed to be ours, a spontaneous getaway I had arranged after his surgery schedule cleared. He had canceled last minute. Now I knew why. He'd been with her. I leaned into the conversation, added a detail he couldn't contradict. The sunset over the Seine was breathtaking, I said. Do you remember, James? We stayed out so late watching the boats pass. His mouth opened, then closed. He nodded, smiled, lied again. And Rachel looked away, just for a second. 17 minutes. I stood briefly to refill my glass, the wine bottle cool against my palm. As I moved around the table, I caught Rachel's eyes. You seem particularly radiant tonight, I said with a smile. Michael will be thrilled to see you. She laughed a little too loudly. He's such a sweetheart, she said. Always knows how to make me feel special. Oh, he would make her feel something tonight, but it wouldn't be special. It would be seismic. As I returned to my seat, I caught James watching me. There was something unreadable in his eyes. Was it suspicion, guilt, regret? Perhaps all three. But it didn't matter anymore. The reckoning was no longer a possibility. It was a guarantee. I checked the time again. 11 minutes. The air seemed heavier now. Or maybe that was just me, holding everything in. I thought about the file in the study, the one with the backup evidence. I thought about the private investigator, waiting outside, ready to enter on cue with the envelope if needed. I thought about the future, about what life might look like after tonight. I wasn't clear. But what I did know is this. It would be honest. It would be mine. Rachel was speaking again, this time about redecorating her guest room. We're thinking of something classic, she said. Creams and navy, maybe a splash of gold. I smiled politely, picturing the floral print of the hotel bedspread she and James had so carelessly disheveled. 5 minutes? The kitchen door creaked. The chef peeked in. I nodded once, subtly. It was time to plate the dessert. Chocolate mousse with raspberry coulis. Sweet, rich, and just bitter enough. And then, just before the first plate could hit the table, the front door opened. From the outside looking in, our life appeared to be a flawless portrait of success and harmony. Dinner guests would often leave our home, commenting on how welcomed they felt, how rare it was to experience such warmth and attentiveness from a host and hostess so thoroughly in sync. Our marriage was held up as the epitome of what modern professional couples aim to achieve, a seamless blend of ambition, mutual respect, and enduring affection. We supported each other through demanding careers with grace, maintaining individual identities without ever compromising the integrity of our partnership. Even after over a decade of marriage, James and I genuinely enjoyed each other's company. We could still laugh over inside jokes, still finish each other's thoughts, still spend hours talking about our dreams. We traveled the world for conferences and leisure alike, bringing back stories from Parisian alleyways and Tokyo tech expos. We made smart investments in art, real estate, retirement portfolios, ensuring a future of security and culture. We surrounded ourselves with a circle of equally accomplished friends, professionals who shared our values, who admired our relationship. We mentored younger colleagues, contributed to nonprofits, and served on influential boards in the community. There was no corner of our public life left untouched by our polished reputation. From every external vantage point, James and I were living the quintessential American dream, crafted with taste, stability, and apparent devotion. We were admired not just for our achievements, but for the elegance with which we seemed to balance them. What I didn't see, what I couldn't possibly have imagined, despite the very nature of my profession, was that James had been methodically constructing a second life, a parallel reality more intricate and calculated than any financial fraud I'd ever uncovered. And at the center of this shadow world was Rachel Montgomery, the woman who would soon sit across from me at my own table, blissfully unaware that her time was running out. She wasn't merely a passive participant. She was the co-architect of a betrayal so complex it would put some of my most challenging forensic cases to shame. The irony was almost poetic. My entire career was built upon detecting discrepancies, spotting when the numbers didn't align, when behaviors contradicted statements, when polished facades concealed corruption. I'd spent years tracing hidden transactions across continents, unraveling webs of deceit buried beneath encrypted ledgers and corporate jargon. I had exposed multi-million-dollar embezzlements with little more than a series of odd invoices and a gut feeling backed by methodical analysis. At Peyton and Associates, I had become something of a legend. Colleagues joked that I could detect a fake expense report from across the conference room. Senior partners brought me their most complex, seemingly unsolvable cases because they knew I would find what others missed. I had traced pharmaceutical fraud buried under inflated clinical research budgets. I had uncovered shell companies operating through 12 international jurisdictions to mask bankruptcy fraud. I'd testified in federal courtrooms, my findings sending white-collar criminals to prison for decades. My methodical nature wasn't just a professional advantage, it was my trademark. The FBI had my number in their contact lists for cases requiring a mind that didn't flinch at encrypted ledgers or endless banking trails. I worked case by case like assembling puzzles, one fragment at a time, until a picture of irrefutable truth emerged. Every brick of evidence, every timestamp, every line item had a purpose. I had no tolerance for assumptions, no time for gut feelings unless they were corroborated with data. Emotional interference was my enemy. Clinical detachment was my ally. It was this detachment that had carried me through high-stakes investigations. But ironically, in my own marriage, that precision had gone dormant. In my personal life, I was just as organized as I was professionally. I kept meticulous calendars that accounted for James's surgical rotations, hospital obligations, medical conferences. I tracked birthdays, anniversaries, social events, down to dietary needs and wine preferences of every friend in our circle. Our parties were masterpieces of curation, spreadsheets guiding everything from seating charts to floral arrangements. James often marveled at how seamlessly I transitioned from unraveling complex frauds to managing our home like a boutique hotel. He would boast to others that I was the most efficient person he knew, that I could run a corporation, a government, a kingdom with the same discipline I brought to planning our annual Christmas gala. My colleagues trusted me to catch legal loopholes and contractual ambushes. Prosecutors leaned on my insights when cases needed airtight forensic testimony. I was a walking lie detector until it came to the one person I loved most. The irony stung like vinegar in a wound. Because despite all this, I missed it. I missed the signs. While I could sense deceit in spreadsheets, I was blind to the lies curling around my own heart. The same precision that made me exceptional at work seemed to evaporate in the warmth of our home. Perhaps I loved James too deeply to see him clearly. Perhaps I clung to the idea of our bond with such conviction that any thought of betrayal felt like self-betrayal. Or maybe, and this is what haunts me, James knew me too well. He understood the structure of my mind, the way I analyzed timelines, noticed behavioral anomalies. He understood that if he made even one wrong financial move, I'd catch it instantly. So he left no paper trail, no strange withdrawals, no bookings I could verify. He timed his deceit to align with his unpredictable surgery schedule. He maintained just enough routine to keep the illusion alive. He played the long game. And I never questioned it. I didn't cross-check his flight itineraries when he claimed to attend surgical symposiums. I didn't call his assistant to confirm conference appearances. I didn't study the creases in his shirts or the scent on his skin when he returned home at 2 a.m. claiming emergencies. I simply believed him completely because I loved him. And love, as I now understand, is the most deceptive veil of all. I trusted James in a way I had never trusted anyone. That trust was my greatest error. In the workplace, I verified everything. In my marriage, I verified nothing. His words were enough, his smiles, his reassurances, his casually perfect explanations. I accepted them all. I didn't just let my guard down, I dismantled it entirely for him. That's what makes betrayal so devastating. Not just the lies, but the trust you placed in someone who weaponized your faith against you, who manipulated your love, not in the heat of passion, but with the cold logic of someone who planned to never get caught. James didn't stumble into an affair, he engineered a covert life. And I'm so skilled at seeing through the smoke screens of powerful corporations and cunning executives. I couldn't see through my own husband. Now, when I think about Rachel, what strikes me most isn't her audacity, it's her confidence. That she believed she could sit across from me, sip my wine, compliment my table settings, and remain undiscovered. She thought she was clever, but she had no idea who I was. She had no idea I had been studying her as closely as I studied criminal ledgers, that I had already mapped the entirety of their affair, cataloged every meeting, every transaction, every text exchanged on encrypted apps they thought no one could trace. And all of it, every shred of it, would be presented not in rage, but in irrefutable clarity. Was ironic, really, how I, someone who routinely dissected elaborate fraud schemes and detected discrepancies in billion-dollar ledgers, had unknowingly constructed blind spots in my own personal life. My husband's increasingly inconsistent behavior, the vanishing affection, the shifting routines, I'd noticed them all. But rather than analyze, I rationalized. I told myself that love required faith, not investigation, that to question James's loyalty was to admit a failure of trust. In choosing to believe, I had ignored every instinct that made me a phenomenal forensic accountant. I had compartmentalized my professional rigor, relegating it to boardrooms and legal depositions. At home, I was the understanding wife, the partner who assumed the best intentions. I genuinely believed that a healthy marriage meant offering grace, not demanding receipts, that love by its nature should be unconditional. But that assumption, so beautiful on the surface, became the most costly misjudgment of my life. While I was helping prosecutors indict financial criminals, my own husband was siphoning away the very foundation of our marriage. He wasn't taking money, he was stealing time, affection, truth. He was redirecting the intimacy and attention that belonged to our union into something false, something clandestine. He was investing emotional capital into a relationship that mocked everything I thought we had built together. The irony of it all cut deepest. I, who had traced millions of dollars through labyrinthine networks of offshore accounts, failed to trace the subtle shifts in my husband's behavior. I, who could detect forged documents within seconds, couldn't see that James's stories about his workdays were nothing more than well-rehearsed fiction. Fiction that he spun with such conviction, even I, his wife, a professional skeptic, believed them. But James had underestimated one thing. Once I began asking the right questions, once my professional instincts reawakened, I would bring the full force of my analytical acumen to bear. I would approach his betrayal the same way I handled federal investigations, thoroughly, methodically, without hesitation. And when I found the truth, I wouldn't simply confront him. I would dismantle the entire illusion. I would expose the betrayal with the same precision I used to uncover corporate embezzlement. The same surgical scrutiny that had sent executives to prison would be repurposed to reveal every layer of James's deception. He had made a critical mistake. He had forgotten that his wife specialized in proving that no one is clever enough to evade the truth forever. He had bet against someone whose career was built on ensuring that people who thought they were untouchable eventually learned just how wrong they were. The changes had been slow, subtle, enough to pass as normal variations in a long-term relationship. I'd told myself that after more than a decade together, of course things would evolve. Careers would become more demanding, rhythms more independent. We'd grown, matured. Naturally, the spark wouldn't always burn the same. But that wasn't growth. It was strategic erosion. James's deception began with his work schedule. For most of our marriage, his surgical days followed a familiar pattern. Tuesdays and Thursdays were typically packed with operations. Mondays were set aside for consultations. Fridays, he did follow-ups. Weekends were reserved for us, unless he was on trauma call, which only happened every few months. But gradually, the pattern disintegrated. He began citing last-minute procedures emergencies, he claimed, that required him to stay at the hospital until late, 10, 11 at night, occasionally even later. He said the complexity of his cases demanded immediate intervention, or that new patients had been added at the last moment. I accepted all of it without scrutiny. I should have questioned it. I should have remembered that James was a sports medicine specialist. His cases rarely involved trauma-level urgency. Weekend emergencies in his field were statistically rare, and when they did occur, they were typically handled by trauma surgeons, not someone with his specialty. But he spoke with such clinical authority, and I was so used to trusting him that I never challenged his narrative. His travel schedule changed next. For most of our marriage, James attended well-documented medical conferences in major cities: Boston, Chicago, San Diego, places I could track. I even accompanied him a few times, blending work with romantic getaways. But suddenly, new conferences emerged. Weekends in Albany, symposiums in Providence, workshops in Burlington, cities that, while plausible, didn't align with the usual locations for prestigious orthopedic seminars. When I suggested joining him, as we'd done in the past, he always had reasons I couldn't argue. The schedule was too tight. The venue lacked accommodations for guests. The content was intensive, leaving no time for leisure. Logical, believable reasons. And so I stayed behind. Those weekends became routine. I found myself eating alone more often. 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. James texted around 6:30 to apologize. He said an unexpected case had come in. He urged me to eat without him. When he finally arrived, usually after 9, he claimed he'd grabbed something quick from the hospital cafeteria. He was too tired to talk, too spent to do more than kiss my forehead and disappear into the bathroom. The weekends we once cherished began to crumble. Our Saturday morning antiquing trips vanished. He always had surgical films to review or patient notes to dictate. Sunday brunches were canceled for surprise emergencies. Our Sunday night dinners, once sacred rituals of cooking and planning, became lonely affairs. I would prepare our favorite dishes while he sat in the study, on a call, or finishing a report. Even his physical habits changed. He began showering immediately after walking through the door, saying the hospital left him feeling contaminated. It was a new ritual. For years, he'd unwind with a drink, ease into the evening before eventually bathing. Now, he barely said hello before disappearing upstairs. He changed colognes, too. Something stronger, more luxurious. His grooming became more frequent, his hair always freshly trimmed. Individually, each detail seemed benign. Together, they formed a pattern, a blueprint for betrayal so carefully constructed I could only marvel at the precision. He had built a facade so convincing I, the woman trained to spot illusion, had lived inside it for months without realizing. But that was over now. The moment I allowed myself to truly examine the inconsistencies, I knew what I was looking at. It was a textbook case of misdirection. Every lie was a ledger entry, every fabricated emergency, a falsified receipt. And like any fraud, the longer it remained unchecked, the more confident the perpetrator became. James had grown reckless, arrogant. He thought he'd outsmarted me, but he didn't know that once I started asking questions, I wouldn't stop until I had every answer. And now I had them all. There's a certain rhythm in a long marriage. Habits repeated so frequently they become invisible. You don't question the familiar. You don't second-guess routines that have been in place for years. That's how it begins. Not with a scream, not with a slammed door, but with a subtle shift. A new cologne, an updated wardrobe, meetings rescheduled to midday. These changes arrive like background noise, noticeable but ignorable. James began dressing differently. The change was gradual, subtle enough not to raise alarms, but distinct enough that in hindsight it seems glaring. He began rotating new suits into his wardrobe, higher end brands than what he'd usually wear for hospital work. He claimed it was necessary for his meetings with prominent athletes and sports agents. Perception is everything, he'd say, adjusting a new Italian silk tie in the mirror. He swapped out his battered nylon briefcase, which had accompanied him faithfully for nearly a decade, for a sleek leather one, monogrammed and far more expensive than anything he'd carried before. At the time, I believed him. After all, his patient base was expanding. He was being invited to more events, asked to consult on athletic injuries that made headlines. Of course, his image mattered. That explanation was plausible, reasonable even. And so I accepted it. With the technology shifts, those should have triggered my suspicions immediately. We had always operated with a level of digital transparency that spoke to our mutual trust. For years, we used each other's phones freely. If one of us was driving, the other would read messages aloud or return calls. We shared photos, appointment reminders, passwords. Privacy was never a concern because there was never anything to hide until there was. James started placing his phone screen down during dinner. If it buzzed, he'd glance at it, then quickly dismiss it or step away to take the call in private. At first, I chalked it up to increasing patient confidentiality, HIPAA regulations, and all that. But it wasn't just the phone. He began taking it with him everywhere, even to the bathroom. That was new. That was different. And then came the computer behavior. James had always been relaxed with his laptop, often asking me to help him locate files, manage his calendar, or proofread his reports. He'd leave it open on the kitchen counter or in his study, trusting that I could access anything if needed. But those days quietly ended. One evening, I entered the study while he was in the shower and found his laptop shut and locked, requiring a new password I didn't know. When I asked, he brushed it off. Hospital policy, he said. They're cracking down on unsecured data. Even his online habits changed. He spent more time browsing in incognito mode, closing tabs when I walked into the room. And though he claimed he was doing research, the duration and secrecy surrounding those sessions raised an itch in my instincts I couldn't quite scratch. And then there were the financial discrepancies. James and I had always reviewed our credit card statements together, monthly sit downs where we tracked spending and adjusted our savings goals. It was a practice we'd committed to during our first year of marriage. It gave us clarity, accountability, partnership. But the last few reviews had been off. Charges appeared that didn't match his explanations. Dinners at upscale restaurants in Hartford, well beyond his hospital's vicinity. Hotel bookings in small towns I had never heard of. Gas purchases in areas he never mentioned traveling to. When I questioned him, he responded smoothly, too smoothly. Networking dinners, professional mixers, out-of-town colleagues in need of accommodations. Each explanation sounded just plausible enough to deter further inquiry. And I wanted to believe him. Desperately. Because to dig deeper meant admitting that my instincts, the very ones I'd trusted to expose corporate fraud, were correct about something far more personal. But the emotional shifts confirmed what I refused to say aloud. James hadn't just become secretive, he had grown distant. He was still attentive, still charming, still physically affectionate, but the authenticity had faded. His responses felt rehearsed. When I spoke about my work, he listened with polite interest, but his eyes drifted. When I shared details about an investigation I was working on, he'd nod and say, interesting, but offer nothing more. Conversations that once extended into the night about morality and truth now ended in silence or subject changes. He used to be fascinated by my work, used to ask questions about how fraudsters rationalized their crimes, how I differentiated intentional deceit from error. Now he avoided those topics altogether. Once, when I casually mentioned that guilty people often over-explain, he immediately changed the subject to vacation plans. It struck me as odd, but I didn't press. Not then. I convinced myself that this was just a phase, that marriages evolved, that deep intimacy over time often gave way to practical partnership. I reminded myself that James was under pressure, professionally ambitious. Maybe he needed more space. Maybe I was being paranoid. But deep down, a whisper had begun to form. A quiet voice echoing in my mind with increasing volume. Something's not right. Still, I resisted. I clung to the version of our life that felt safe. Until the night that resistance shattered. It was a Tuesday evening in October. I was in our bedroom preparing James's wardrobe for his upcoming trip to Burlington. He'd told me it was an orthopedic symposium, intensive, 3 days, multiple presentations. I'd helped pack for dozens of these over the years. I knew the rhythm: suits, casual wear, toiletries, chargers. I moved through the motions automatically. Downstairs, he was in his home office, supposedly reviewing patient notes for the following day's surgeries. Upstairs, I was folding shirts and organizing ties when I reached into the inside pocket of his navy blazer, the one he'd worn to a recent hospital dinner, and found something that didn't belong. It was a folded card, small, elegant, and embossed with the gold logo of the Grand View Resort and Spa. My stomach twisted. It wasn't the card itself that froze my blood. It was the context. The Grand View wasn't a business hotel. It was a secluded luxury resort 90 minutes north of our city, known for couples retreats and romantic getaways. Rooms cost upward of $800, 0 cents a night. It offered private balconies, spa packages, and in-room fireplaces. This wasn't where orthopedic surgeons went for conferences. This was where lovers went to escape. My hands trembled as I opened the card holder. Inside was a key card. The date was recent. Too recent. My brain buzzed, 1,000 calculations at once, trying to match his claimed schedule against what I now held in my hand. My pulse roared in my ears, my breath shallow. I stood frozen in our bedroom, suddenly alien in the space I once considered safest. The room, the clothes, the walls, all of it seemed unreal. I could hear James's voice downstairs, still talking into his headset, utterly unaware that the narrative he had so carefully constructed had just cracked. The card burned in my hand like a secret that had waited too long to be revealed. I sat on the edge of the bed, the hotel key resting on my palm, blinking down at it as if I could wish it away. But the gold embossed letters of the Grand View Resort shimmered with finality. No matter how many logical explanations I searched for, there was only one conclusion left to draw. This wasn't a business trip. This wasn't professional. This wasn't innocent. James had gone to the Grand View, and he hadn't gone alone. My breath caught in my chest. The room felt suddenly unfamiliar. I looked around at our bedroom, our shared sanctuary, now transformed into a crime scene in the quietest, most personal way. The polished dresser where James's cologne bottles lined up in perfect order, the framed photo of our wedding on the nightstand, the cozy king-size bed with matching pillows I'd fluffed that morning before heading to work. Everything we'd built, every thread of our shared life, now seemed tainted, vulnerable to contamination by lies. I didn't confront him right away. My instincts, though, screaming in betrayal, told me to wait, to watch, to verify. I needed more than emotion. I needed clarity, evidence, confirmation that what I suspected wasn't just a gut feeling, but a truth backed by proof. So I began collecting. I didn't just follow my heart, I followed the patterns. I pulled our credit card statements from the last 6 months. Transactions at the Grand View appeared 4 times, each carefully timed to coincide with supposed medical symposiums or hospital conferences. I compared those dates to claimed locations, and none of them aligned with known orthopedic events, not even loosely. Worse still, 2 of those dates matched weekends I had visited my sister in Vermont, a perfect alibi for him and an opportunity he had clearly exploited. Then I checked his phone, not directly, he'd grown far too cautious for that, but through the cloud. James had forgotten that an older tablet still synced with his messages buried in a drawer of our downstairs office. I'd powered it on one night while he slept. What I found made my hand shake and my throat dry. Hundreds of texts, dozens of photos, all from one contact name, R. They weren't overtly explicit, he was smarter than that, but they were unmistakably intimate. Inside jokes I didn't understand. Flirtatious winks, photos of wine glasses clinking beside a fireplace, her bare feet propped on a balcony railing, snippets of conversations laced with code and shared secrecy. And one message that shattered everything. I hate that we have to sneak around, but I love how alive I feel when I'm with you. That's what she was stealing from me. The version of James who laughed easily, who touched my back when he passed, who whispered about growing old together under soft covers. That version had vanished because it had been given to someone else. Piece by piece, heartbeat by heartbeat, he'd handed it over to Rachel. I felt like I was drowning, but I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I took screenshots, I organized files, I documented everything. Because if I had learned anything from my career, it was this. Emotion could be dismissed, but facts had power. Facts left no room for argument. And so I created my own investigation file, stored under innocuous names and folders, each piece meticulously labeled. Hotel receipts, text archive, timeline. I mapped their affair with the precision of a detective. I built a timeline that cross-referenced every suspicious trip with verifiable inconsistencies. I even checked hospital parking logs against his badge swipes. The gaps were glaring. Rachel had always been within our circle, someone I had once welcomed into our home without hesitation. We had served on a charity board together, hosted events as couples. I had poured her wine at my table. I had listened to her complain about her own marriage, sympathizing with a woman who, it turned out, was tearing into mine. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was surgical. Every act of deception had been calculated. Not spontaneous, not desperate, coordinated. She had known exactly what she was doing, and so did James. But if they thought I would confront them in chaos, they were mistaken. I wouldn't let this story end in a shouting match or a tearful confession. I wanted something better. I wanted them to feel the depth of what they had done, not just in private, but in front of those who had admired them, who believed in them. I wanted the truth to land like thunder in a clear sky, impossible to ignore. So I planned a dinner, not just any dinner, one designed down to the minute, the menu, the guest list. Rachel and James would sit at my table, basking in the illusion of control, unaware that it was about to implode. And I invited Michael, sweet, unsuspecting Michael, the man who brought Rachel flowers, who still looked at her like she was his miracle. He deserved the truth, too. He deserved to see what had been done to him by the person he trusted most. The days leading up to that dinner moved slowly, each one stretching like a held breath. James grew more relaxed, unaware that I had seen everything. He kissed me goodbye in the mornings. He brought me coffee on Sunday. He even suggested a weekend trip, as if to reinforce his role as the perfect husband. And I played along. I smiled. I accepted the coffee. I asked about his day because I knew the time for confrontation wasn't in the heat of discovery, it was in the cold clarity of exposure. The night of the dinner arrived like a stage cue, every detail in place, every guest seated, every lie ready to be unmasked. Rachel was radiant, of course, confident. She wore a sapphire dress that clung to her frame, paired with understated pearls and the kind of smugness only someone in a secret affair can wear comfortably. She leaned into James during dinner, whispered, touched his hand when she laughed. And I watched. I watched it all. I let her play her part until the doorbell rang. James looked up, confused. Rachel's smile faltered. Michael stepped into the room, bouquet in hand, eyes lit with affection. He scanned the room, expecting surprise. Instead, he found stillness, the kind that comes before a storm. Darling, he said to Rachel, you didn't think I'd miss our big night, did you? Her face went pale, and that's when I stood. The silence in the room was so complete, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone's chest. Rachel's face, usually composed and poised, contorted in confusion, then horror, then panic. She blinked rapidly, as though trying to reset the scene in front of her, as if reality had glitched and she could reboot it by sheer will. But reality didn't bend to her tonight. It belonged to me now. Michael stepped inside, the bouquet of lilies trembling slightly in his grip. He wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes scanned the room, registering each expression, each frozen, startled face. Then they settled on Rachel. You look surprised, he said, voice low and flat. You told me this was a private dinner with close friends. I didn't realize James would be here too. The air shifted. Rachel opened her mouth, but no sound came out. James stiffened beside her, his wine glass half raised. The light from the chandelier threw long shadows across the table, illuminating every line of guilt on their faces. I didn't speak immediately. I wanted the moment to stretch, to press down on them with the same quiet agony they had forced me to carry for months. I rose from my chair slowly, as though pulled by gravity, and set my napkin neatly beside my plate. Michael, I said, my voice clear and calm, thank you for coming. I know this isn't what you expected, but there's something you and everyone else here deserve to know. I turned toward the rest of the guests, each one now rigid in their seats. These were people who had been part of our story, colleagues, friends, witnesses. They'd toasted our anniversaries, celebrated our promotions. They were the jury I'd chosen, and it was time to present the case. I walked to the sideboard and opened the top drawer, retrieving a thin manila folder. Every item inside had been curated with care. A timeline of the affair, receipts, hotel confirmations, texts, photos, all compiled not out of pettiness, but precision, truth arranged chronologically. I know this is unconventional, I continued, but sometimes the truth needs an audience, and tonight it has one. James's face had drained of color. He started to rise. Let's talk about this privately, he said, his voice tight with warning. I shook my head. No, James. We're not sweeping this into a dark corner. You chose to make your lies part of our lives, our dinners, our friends, our memories, so you can face the truth in front of them. I handed the folder to Michael. His hands shook as he opened it, scanning the first page. His lips moved as he read the date, then the timestamp, then the hotel name. The silence broke with a soft, awful sound of realization. He flipped to the next page, then the next. A photo of Rachel's feet on a hotel balcony, a receipt signed with her initials, a message, I wish we could wake up like this every day. Rachel gasped. Where did you, how did you, she couldn't finish the sentence. I'm a forensic accountant, Rachel, I said. You think I track fraud for billion-dollar corporations but can't trace a weekend affair? Michael looked up, devastated. Is this true? He asked her, barely above a whisper. Tell me it's not. Please? Rachel couldn't meet his eyes. James stood, knocking over his chair. Enough, he snapped. You made your point. No, I replied evenly. Not yet. I stepped toward him, feeling the storm in my chest finally give way to clarity. You didn't just cheat. You dismantled a life we spent years building. You took the most sacred parts of our relationship, trust, intimacy, respect, and gave them to someone else. And you thought you could hide it with a few carefully constructed lies? He opened his mouth again, but I didn't let him speak. I turned back to the guests. I know this is uncomfortable. I know it's not the evening you expected. But I need you to hear this, not because I want pity, but because the truth matters, not just in courtrooms or spreadsheets, but in our lives. And this betrayal should not stay hidden. The room remained still. Some guests looked away. Others stared at James and Rachel with a mix of sympathy and disbelief. I didn't care which. They could choose their side. But I had chosen mine. Michael gently set the folder down. His face was blank, stunned into silence. He turned to Rachel. You told me we were building something real, he said quietly. Was it all a lie? Rachel's voice cracked. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. But it did, he said. You meant for it to happen behind my back. You meant for it to happen while smiling in my face. James tried again. Can we at least talk in private? Just us? I looked at him with the same cold professionalism I had used in courtrooms. I have nothing more to say to you in private, James. You lied in private. You betrayed in private. This truth belongs in the open. Someone cleared their throat. It was Sarah, an old friend from college, seated at the far end of the table. Ah, I'm so sorry, she whispered. Her voice broke something in me. A crack that let a sliver of emotion escape. I didn't want it to be like this, I admitted, turning to her. But it needed to be. I spent months blaming myself, wondering if I had misread the signs, if I was too distracted, too trusting. But I wasn't. I just didn't want to believe that people I loved could be so reckless with my heart. Rachel finally stood, tears running down her cheeks. Please, she said, don't destroy everything. It was a mistake. A terrible mistake. I stared at her. It wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Repeated, hidden, protected. She looked at Michael again, but he shook his head. I need to go, he said. He moved toward the door like a man underwater. Slow, disoriented, Rachel followed, but he stopped her with a single raised hand. Don't. And just like that, she stood alone. James remained at the table, breathing heavily, his hands curled into fists. You've humiliated us. No, I said. You did that. I just illuminated it. And with that, I walked to the kitchen, picked up the dessert that had been waiting on the sideboard, and returned to the dining room. I placed the tray gently in front of our stunned guests. Chocolate mousse, I said, with raspberry coulis. Please, stay, eat. No reason to let one betrayal ruin a good dessert. They thought they were being clever, careful even, using encrypted messaging apps, meeting in locations just far enough off the radar, timing their rendezvous so nothing could be easily traced. James used cash advances, prepaid credit cards, anything that wouldn't raise a red flag on our joint statements. Rachel had her own protocols too. No personal photos, no phone calls from home, no evidence. But what they failed to understand was that meticulous secrecy doesn't erase patterns, it creates them. Their very caution produced a trail, subtle, yes, but one I was uniquely equipped to follow. As I pored through James's recent cash withdrawals and cross-referenced them with Rachel's social media activity, the pattern began to crystallize. The timing was uncanny. Each withdrawal lined up with Rachel's curated posts, champagne glasses, artfully blurred gourmet dishes. the unmistakable glow of luxury in her hotel backdrops. She never tagged locations, but I didn't need her to. I recognized the ambiance, the lighting, even the linens. The resorts were familiar to me. We'd stayed in some of them together years ago. I mapped those dates and discovered another alignment: James's so-called conference weekends. The destinations didn't match the events he cited, but they did match the regions where Rachel posted her vacation snapshots. At first, I thought it could be coincidence, but as the entries multiplied, my doubt vanished. I examined his surgical schedule, looking for discrepancies, and sure enough, every emergency operation he claimed during a weekend aligned with Rachel's open appointments on her professional calendar. She was a therapist, her availability was public for clients. The alignment wasn't just suspicious, it was mathematical. But the most damning piece wasn't found in their present, it was in their plans for the future. I discovered that Rachel had begun dissolving her business partnerships in quiet, strategic steps. She was downsizing her client roster, slowly stepping away from obligations. Her actions didn't point to burnout or a career pivot. They pointed to a transition, one that required freedom, mobility, and secrecy. James, in turn, had been researching real estate listings in other states, not for investment purposes, as he'd claimed, but in neighborhoods connected to Rachel's extended family. Places where her parents had retired, places she had childhood ties to. He had folders saved, properties bookmarked. He had made inquiries through his personal email, bypassing the family accountant. The picture formed in my mind slowly, but vividly. James wasn't just cheating, he was preparing to leave. He and Rachel were plotting an escape route. Their weekend at the Grandview Resort wasn't a moment of impulsive indulgence. It was a scouting trip, a soft launch of the life they planned to build without us. By the time I finished assembling the evidence, I had enough to dismantle their lives completely, professionally, personally, socially. With a single email, I could ruin them both. But simply outing them wasn't enough. What they had done was elaborate, deliberate, calculated. Their punishment had to match that energy. Exposure alone wouldn't satisfy justice. They deserved to be unraveled with the same finesse they used to deceive. Their truth needed to emerge, not in fury, but in silence, in the stillness that follows undeniable evidence. They had lied so smoothly, maintained the charade so effectively. They deserved a reveal that was just as orchestrated. That's when the dinner party came to life in my mind, not as a confrontation, but as a conclusion. It started with a conversation I overheard. James was speaking with Dr. Patricia Henley, a colleague from the orthopedic board, about an upcoming medical conference in Boston. Patricia mentioned in passing that her husband, Michael, would be joining her for the weekend. "We're turning it into a little romantic getaway," she said with a smile. That line, it lit a match in my mind. It wasn't just the notion of combining business with pleasure, it was the perfect parallel. Rachel, too, would expect romance. Her 5th wedding anniversary was in November. She'd been dropping increasingly extravagant hints on social media, posts about meaningful gifts, anniversary dinner ideas, elegant destinations. She was playing both roles: the dutiful wife waiting grand gestures, and the secret lover plotting her escape. The hypocrisy was almost elegant in its arrogance. I began investigating Rachel Montgomery not just as my husband's mistress, but as the subject in one of my most intricate forensic projects. I combed through her professional profiles, clinic websites, reviews, networking platforms. I built a digital file the way I would for a high-value fraud suspect. What I found only deepened the irony. Rachel wasn't just a therapist, she specialized in relationship counseling. Her website listed integrity and authentic communication among her core values. She gave TEDx-style talks about rebuilding trust in marriages, and all the while, She was betraying the man who adored her while helping to dismantle mine. Her husband, Dr. Michael Montgomery, was a respected cardiologist at Hartford General, a man involved in medical ethics boards, a man who, by all accounts, lived by a code of principle and service. His social media was a tribute to his wife, photos of Rachel at fundraisers, at speaking events, smiling beside him at galas. He always captioned them with admiration, affection, pride. Still can't believe she chose me, he'd written on their last anniversary. He was the perfect counterbalance to me. Two betrayed spouses, two lives unraveling without their consent. The challenge wasn't merely revealing the truth, it was finding the perfect stage. That's when Sarah Chen, a senior partner at Patone and Associates, mentioned medical ethics symposium her husband David was organizing. It would bring together doctors from various specialties to discuss topics like professional boundaries and personal conduct in high-pressure environments. I asked casually if they needed help coordinating the event. My skill set, after all, made me an ideal planner. Offered to assist with guest curation and logistics. I didn't just volunteer, I curated. I ensured that James was invited as a panelist for a discussion on sports medicine integrity. I also had Michael Montgomery invited to speak on medical ethics and the blurring lines between professional and personal relationships. The topics were almost poetic in their implications. They wouldn't know it yet, but they were walking into a trap, one built from their own contradictions. The symposium would end with a formal dinner, an elegant, catered evening at Millbrook Country Club, the same venue where James and I had celebrated our wedding 11 years earlier. That detail was intentional. I wanted their deception to die in the same room where our vows were born. But the dinner alone wasn't enough. I arranged the seating chart so James and Rachel were positioned 2 tables apart, separated just enough to appear accidental. Michael and I would sit at the center table, surrounded by mutual friends and industry leaders. All the witnesses would be present, people whose opinions mattered, whose presence would lend the revelation undeniable credibility. The plan was nearly complete, but it needed one final flourish, something Rachel and James would never anticipate. I reached out to a former client of mine, a digital forensics expert now working in security consultation. I asked him to reconstruct a slideshow from the metadata of Rachel's hidden photos, timed with James's calendar, matched to locations. With his help, I built a visual timeline. Not just text, not just receipts, a visual map of betrayal, the kind that couldn't be denied. And as the pieces fell into place, I felt a strange calm settle over me. This wasn't vengeance. This was precision. To set the final phase in motion, I needed Rachel to walk straight into the trap, completely unaware, utterly confident. That required a separate but perfectly coordinated strategy, one that exploited her professional ambitions and unrelenting hunger for recognition. She had always been a woman drawn to prestige, titles, and curated attention. So I designed a lure tailored precisely to her vanity. I created a fictional consulting opportunity through a carefully constructed shell company, using the very same methods I'd perfected while tracking hidden assets for multinational fraud cases. The company, Veritas Integrative Wellness, appeared as a high-end, exclusive rehabilitation center in development, one with plans to expand into the lucrative niche of sports medicine therapy. The branding was sleek, the mission statement refined, the founders' bios fabricated from composite identities that mirrored the elite wellness world. Every detail was exact, down to the website, the placeholder press release, and the email signatures. Using a secure alias, I posed as a strategic outreach executive named Cassandra Meyer, reaching out to Rachel with a custom pitch that flattered her credentials and played directly into her sense of self-importance. Veritas was expanding, I told her, and they were deeply impressed with her background in physical and emotional therapy for high-performing professionals. Would she be available for an exploratory consultation? The meeting was to coincide with the upcoming medical symposium weekend. As part of the invitation, I mentioned a networking dinner that would include not only fellow consultants, but also potential investors, executives, and physicians interested in cross referral opportunities. I emphasized the exclusivity of the event, assuring her she would be the only therapist in attendance, which would naturally position her as the voice of authority. To sweeten the deal, I suggested she bring her husband, Dr. Michael Montgomery. He's a leading cardiologist, I wrote, and several of our investors are actively exploring holistic cardiovascular partnerships. His presence would be a strategic asset. I knew Rachel would see this as a dual opportunity, not just to showcase herself, but to elevate her husband's career, which she often treated as an accessory to her own image. Her response came within the hour. Giddy, effusive, she was honored, thrilled, and curious about the investors. She even offered to invite a few additional colleagues who might find the retreat concept intriguing. That gave me the perfect opening to mention that Dr. James Ashford would also be attending. I believe Dr. Ashford has a reputation for both medical excellence and forward thinking patient care, I wrote. We are particularly interested in his take on athlete rehabilitation protocols. Rachel took the bait without hesitation. Her reply was a flurry of excitement and anticipation. She called it a serendipitous opportunity and promised to prepare an outline of her consultation approach in advance. I could almost see her already imagining herself at the head of the room, speaking with poise, being admired for her insight. And just like that, the stage was set. James would arrive believing he was fulfilling a mundane professional obligation tied to the symposium. Rachel would walk in believing she was moments away from a career breakthrough. Michael would attend, thinking he was there to support his wife's ambitions and build professional connections. None of them would know that they were about to walk into the most meticulously orchestrated exposure of adultery Millbrook Heights had ever witnessed. But planning the guest list was only one facet of the operation. I needed indisputable proof, concrete, layered documentation. Because if Rachel or James attempted to spin or manipulate the narrative, the evidence had to be too overwhelming to allow for denial or damage control. So I hired Elena Rodriguez. Elena was a seasoned private investigator with a background in law enforcement, someone I had been introduced to through a colleague who'd used her during a high-stakes divorce. Discreet, meticulous, experienced with high-profile targets, she was perfect. Elena knew how to capture moments that mattered. Hands brushing across restaurant tables, cars parked overnight at undisclosed locations, time-stamped footage with verifiable geolocation metadata. She operated like a ghost, and within 2 weeks, she had compiled a portfolio that rivaled any corporate criminal case I had built in my career. Her findings were conclusive. James and Rachel had grown lazy in their secrecy. They met for lunch in the private dining areas of Hartford's best restaurants, no longer bothering to sit apart. They shared private corners of hotel lobbies, took weekend trips where they no longer wore disguises or altered their travel logs. They were confident that no one was watching. They were wrong. The surveillance captured them arriving at the Grand View Resort in separate cars, entering the same suite minutes apart. It documented a kiss in the parking garage, a shared bottle of wine delivered by room service, James pacing the balcony on the phone while Rachel adjusted her hair in the reflection of the sliding glass door. Elena even caught a moment of laughter that looked too intimate to misinterpret, too natural to be anything other than what it was. This was the final puzzle piece. The last step was timing. To deliver maximum impact, I had to present the evidence when all four parties were present, when there could be no retreat. Not too early, James or Rachel might excuse themselves before the climax. Not too late, the crowd might begin to thin. The moment had to occur at the precise intersection of attention and vulnerability. I choreographed the evening the way one choreographs a performance. Music, ambiance, lighting, pacing. The ballroom of the Millbrook Country Club was elegant, understated, and charged with anticipation. It had been decorated for winter, with delicate silver accents and crystal garlands that shimmered beneath the soft glow of chandeliers. A pianist played near the fireplace. Waiters moved silently between tables. 72 hours before the event, I felt the same heightened state of mental clarity I always experience before a major financial deposition or federal testimony. My nerves were taut but not rattled. Every variable had been accounted for, every outcome modeled. There was no margin for error. I wasn't just revealing an affair, I was ending an illusion. On the evening of the event, I stood in front of my mirror, adjusting the neckline of the midnight blue dress I'd chosen for the occasion. It was elegant, commanding, structured in a way that communicated control. I added diamond studs, a sleek updo, and a swipe of lipstick that matched the quiet precision of everything else I'd planned. James had left the house 2 hours earlier, claiming he needed to prepare for his panel. In reality, I knew from Elena's report that he had checked into the Grandview Resort for a mid-afternoon tryst. He and Rachel believed it would be their final secret rendezvous before transitioning to a public relationship. The irony was staggering. They imagined they were hours from liberation, while I stood poised to detonate the cage they had built around us all. Their entire romantic afternoon was being documented in high definition. Professional-grade equipment hidden in potted plants and mounted under fixtures had captured them laughing, kissing, embracing. It would be part of the final evidence package, a truth they would not be able to rewrite. As I entered the ballroom that evening, I scanned the crowd. Prominent surgeons, renowned physicians, influential hospital administrators. The atmosphere buzzed with polished conversation and laughter. Among them stood the three people who would soon find themselves at the epicenter of a revelation so surgical, so devastating, that none of them would emerge unchanged. And I was ready. There was a surreal clarity in that moment, like the sharp focus that comes before a final breath. The ballroom's golden light bathed every corner in elegance, disguising the drama poised to unfold beneath its glittering surface. To anyone else, it was just another formal event. To me, it felt like the closing of a loop, an arc that began with betrayal and would now resolve in revelation. The deception that once haunted me in whispers was about to dissolve in the most public silence imaginable. I arrived exactly on time, not early, not late, precisely when intended. My place near the entrance offered the perfect vantage point. I could observe the entrances, gauge reactions, time every move with the exactitude of a chess master. The seating chart I'd meticulously arranged under the guise of volunteering was now a loaded weapon. Each name card a silent cue, each seat a strategic placement in this symphony of truth. Michael Montgomery was the first to arrive. Dressed in a crisply tailored black suit that complemented his quiet dignity, he moved through the room like someone genuinely at ease in this world of prestige and polite conversation. His silver hair and warm eyes gave him the kind of charisma that didn't need to be loud. He paused often, shaking hands, sharing brief conversations, but even amid the pleasantries, he kept checking his watch. Subtle, frequent glances that betrayed his anticipation. He was waiting for Rachel. When I approached and introduced myself as one of the coordinators for the evening, he greeted me with kind enthusiasm, entirely unaware of the storm that loomed just beyond his line of sight. "Thank you for organizing this," he said earnestly. "Rachel's been talking about this event for weeks. She's so excited to share her ideas, and honestly, his sincerity cut sharper than any accusation ever could. He had no idea that at that very moment, the woman he adored was in a luxury hotel suite with another man, my husband, preparing for what they believed was their last private meeting before revealing their relationship to the world. They were rehearsing freedom. What they didn't know was that I was about to rewrite their script entirely. James arrived 20 minutes later. He walked in with that familiar surgeon's gait, confident, controlled, but his eyes moved with unmistakable nervousness. He was expecting something small, intimate, manageable. What he found was a gathering far larger and far more intertwined than he'd planned for. Prominent physicians from the hospital board, ethics committee members, colleagues who had worked alongside both him and Michael. The realization struck him immediately. He wasn't just at a dinner, he was on stage. His eyes darted across the room until they landed on Michael. The color drained from his face. Even from across the room, I could see his jaw tighten as he mentally calculated the odds. Was this a coincidence? Or something more? Was Rachel already here? Had they made a misstep? He approached me with artificial calm. I didn't realize this would be such a packed event, he said. Some surprise guests, huh? I smiled, the picture of diplomatic composure. Yes, the response was overwhelming. A few last-minute additions, several prominent names asked to join, and of course, we couldn't say no. He nodded, his throat moving in a nervous swallow. He knew something was off. He just didn't know how badly. Rachel arrived 30 minutes later. Her entrance wasn't dramatic, but the shift in energy was palpable. She was stunning. An emerald dress hugging her figure, her auburn hair swept back in a style that made her look effortlessly poised. Her expression, however, betrayed her the moment she spotted both her husband and James in the same room. She froze for a split second. Not enough for the untrained eye to notice, but I saw it. The microsecond of panic, the flash of disbelief. She hadn't expected this convergence. Her mind scrambled for a new strategy, even as her heels clicked confidently across the marble floor. She greeted Michael with a kiss on the cheek and a carefully measured smile. Then she placed herself strategically near the bar, keeping both men in her peripheral vision while maintaining an air of effortless sociability. The game had begun. The dinner, the seating chart I'd engineered, worked like a precisely tuned mechanism. Rachel sat diagonally from Michael, close enough for him to see her reactions, but not so close that casual contact could occur. James was positioned 2 seats down on her right. No one would suspect collusion, but their proximity was enough that body language could betray them under pressure. The first course, a delicate butternut squash bisque, was served, absurdly civilized for what was about to unfold. I began guiding the table conversation with calculated charm. It's always interesting to me, I said casually, how those of us in high-pressure careers manage the boundaries between work and life. I gestured lightly toward Michael. Especially couples who both work in medicine. How do you two maintain balance? Michael smiled warmly. It's all about communication, he said. Rachel and I have always made honesty our priority, even when it's difficult. That's been our anchor. Rachel smiled tightly. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her glass. James said little. As the conversation moved toward medical ethics and the importance of integrity, his discomfort grew visible. He dabbed his mouth frequently, shifted in his seat. His wine glass stayed half full. Rachel's voice became softer, her eye contact less frequent. That was the signal. As the main course, herb-crusted salmon and roasted vegetables, was placed before us, I reached into my evening clutch and drew out the manila envelope. Months of surveillance, dozens of receipts, a visual timeline neatly arranged and authenticated. Before we move on to dessert, I said, my voice firm but calm. There's something I think we all need to understand about the importance of boundaries and trust, especially in our field where personal choices often reflect professional credibility. The conversation stopped. Glasses were set down. Forks paused. Faces turned toward me. Michael looked intrigued, not yet alarmed. Rachel stiffened. James froze completely. His eyes locked on the envelope in my hand. This evening's discussion about professional ethics feels particularly relevant, I continued, given that we have an extraordinary case study at this very table. I opened the envelope with deliberate grace. The silence that followed was cathedral-like, broken only by the faint clink of silverware and the soft movement of waiters clearing plates. Every eye at our table was fixed on me. The clinking of forks and hushed conversation from nearby tables became background noise, fading behind the palpable tension that gripped our corner of the room. These weren't just guests anymore. They were now spectators, unwitting jurors to the unfolding case. And I was about to present the irrefutable evidence, piece by piece, with the same methodical precision that had earned me a reputation for forensic brilliance. The first photograph I slid onto the crisp white linen tablecloth was both damning and unmistakable. It showed James and Rachel entering the Grandview Resort just 3 hours earlier. There was no mistaking the familiarity in their body language. His hand resting possessively on the small of her back, her leaning in toward him with a smile that wasn't casual or innocent. They looked practiced, comfortable, two people accustomed to each other's touch. Michael's fork slipped from his fingers and clattered against his plate, the sound loud in the sudden stillness. He stared at the image, blinking rapidly. In those few seconds, I saw him shift through disbelief, confusion, and the slow, dawning horror of recognition. I I don't understand, he said, his voice barely audible. Rachel told me she was meeting potential investors this afternoon. She was meeting someone, I said, calm and unwavering. But not investors. A collective inhale swept the table. Even the waitstaff, usually invisible, slowed in their steps. I placed the second photograph down beside the first. Rachel and James on the resort's private balcony, locked in a tender embrace. Their faces were turned toward each other with the kind of intimacy that couldn't be faked or explained away. It wasn't lust or reckless spontaneity. It was affection born of familiarity, deep, deliberate, and well-practiced. Rachel's face went white. Her emerald dress, which had earlier shimmered under the ballroom lights, now emphasized the pallor spreading across her features. She looked ill, as if her body was trying to reject the scene unfolding in front of her. "Victoria, please," she whispered. Her voice was cracked, pleading. "You don't understand the situation." "Oh, I understand perfectly," I said, keeping my voice even and controlled. "I've spent 4 months investigating the full scope of your relationship with my husband. Would you like me to outline exactly what I've found?" James's face contorted with panic. He finally spoke, but his voice trembled under the strain. "Victoria, this isn't the time or the place for this discussion. Let's talk about this privately." I turned to him with the practiced stillness I'd used to dismantle hostile witnesses in court. "You mean like the way you've been having private conversations with Rachel for the past 14 months? Like the private weekends at luxury resorts you lied about? Or the private plans for your future together while pretending everything was fine with me?" The silence grew heavier. Even Dr. Patricia Henley, the respected symposium organizer seated 2 places down, looked frozen, caught between professional concern and sheer fascination. Other physicians and their spouses leaned in ever so slightly, drawn into the gravitational pull of the unraveling scandal. They wouldn't say anything, not yet, but the ripple effect had already begun. I reached for the envelope again and pulled out several more documents, placing them methodically across the table. Hotel receipts with matching dates to James's so-called conferences, restaurant bills from intimate dinners billed to a credit card Michael had never seen, jewelry receipts for expensive pieces Rachel wore in her social media posts, but never once appeared in my home. 14 months, I said, louder this time. I wanted everyone to hear it. Not a momentary lapse, not a weekend mistake, a planned, persistent, and deliberate affair involving financial lies, emotional manipulation, and the complete betrayal of 2 marriages. Michael had gone rigid, his hand clenched around his napkin as he studied the evidence in front of him like a cardiology scan, revealing a fatal blockage. "All those medical conferences you've been attending lately," he said, his voice low and steady, "they weren't real." Rachel tried to recover, Some of them were, she said quickly, the desperation surfacing. I mean, I did attend legitimate events. This isn't what it looks like. I placed another photo down, this one of James and Rachel kissing passionately in the parking lot of an upscale Hartford restaurant, oblivious to surveillance. Then tell us what it does look like, Rachel, I said sharply, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you and my husband have been conducting a well organized affair behind our backs, one that involved lies to both your husband and me, along with everyone else who trusted you. The buzz at surrounding tables dimmed. The conversation throughout the ballroom had quieted to a hush as heads subtly turned toward our table. People strained to listen while pretending not to. James tried again, this time with a voice coded in faux authority. This is a misunderstanding, he said. Victoria has misinterpreted some professional interactions. Professional interactions? I repeated, raising an eyebrow. I pulled out my phone, opened the message archive recovered by Elena's surveillance software, and began to read aloud. Quote, I can't wait until we can finally be together openly. These secret meetings are killing me, but knowing we'll have forever makes it all worthwhile, end quote. I paused for effect. That message, I continued, was sent from your phone to Rachel's number last Tuesday afternoon. Do you remember where you were, James? Because I do. You said you had a surgical consultation and would be home late. Michael's hands were trembling. He reached for his wine glass, and I watched the man who healed hearts every day struggle to hold his own together. 5 years of marriage, he said to no one in particular. 5 years of believing we were building something real. You were, I said quietly, turning to him with a rare moment of softness. You were building something real, but Rachel was building something else entirely. That was the final crack. Rachel broke completely. Tears spilled over her mascara, streaking her flawless makeup. Her shoulders trembled, and for the first time that evening, she looked truly human, not calculated, not composed, just shattered. The devastation on Rachel's face was unmistakable. She wasn't just embarrassed, she was shattered. Her elaborate scaffolding of secrecy had collapsed in front of a crowd of colleagues, friends, and spouses. But what pierced her more deeply than the scandal was the realization that every lie, every excuse, every backdoor meeting she thought was hidden had been thoroughly exposed and documented. She had played a long game of deception, but I had played a longer one of truth. I never meant for it to happen like this, Rachel sobbed, her voice barely coherent between gasps. James and we fell in love. We didn't plan this. We couldn't help ourselves. My restraint, maintained like a dam for months, began to crack. The cold fury I had kept sealed behind professional poise erupted with controlled force. You couldn't help yourselves? I asked, my voice sharp and deliberate. You couldn't help lying to your husband while fabricating fake weekend conferences? You couldn't help siphoning funds from our shared accounts to pay for your romantic escapades? You couldn't help building a future with my husband behind my back while pretending to be a loyal wife? The room had transformed into a theater of silence. The rest of the ballroom, the glittering silver table settings, the soft piano in the corner, the light hum of background conversation had fallen away. All eyes, every last one of them, were trained on us. Phones emerged discreetly. Dinner companions whispered. Glasses of wine were paused mid-sip as realization rippled from table to table. This wasn't just an affair being exposed. It was the public implosion of two lives. Carefully curated, socially revered lives, reduced to rubble in a single evening. Dr. Patricia Henley, the esteemed ethics chairwoman who had initially invited James to the symposium, leaned forward and spoke with calm authority. Perhaps this conversation would be better continued in a more private setting, she offered diplomatically. No, Michael said, his voice startlingly resolute. He hadn't said much up until now, but when he did, the conviction in his tone silenced the room more effectively than a gavel in a courtroom. If my wife has been conducting a public affair with Dr. Ashford, then the consequences should be equally public. I want everyone here to understand exactly who they've been associating with. James stood up slowly, his expression one of mounting desperation. He tried to summon the same composure he used during complex surgeries and press briefings, the same tone he used to calm patients' fears. But it didn't land here. Not anymore. I think everyone needs to calm down, he said, voice straining to sound rational. Emotions are high. Let's take a step back before we all say something we'll regret. The only thing I regret, I said, rising to meet his gaze without flinching, is wasting 11 years of my life believing you are a man of integrity. But I don't regret uncovering the truth. And I certainly don't regret making sure everyone here knows exactly the kind of person you are. The consequences didn't just hang in the air, they detonated. You could feel it ripple through the space like a slow-moving wave. Every doctor, nurse, administrator, and guest present had witnessed it. There would be no containing the fallout, no version of this story that could be reshaped into something manageable. The evidence, the confrontation, the names, all of it was now common knowledge in the Connecticut medical elite. And it was exactly the point. The aftermath began that very night. By morning, screenshots of the confrontation, snippets of the dialogue, and even short video clips had spread through group chats, private forums, and eventually professional networks. The next week brought whispers in hospital hallways and boardrooms, conversations veiled in euphemisms, a situation, an unfortunate entanglement, but no one was fooled. James's downfall came swiftly. The Millbrook General Hospital Board launched a formal inquiry into his conduct. Though no direct patient misconduct was found, their investigation uncovered falsified time logs and fabricated medical consultations. He had used hospital resources to meet Rachel, arranging fictitious outpatient appointments, booking overnight on-call stays when he was really out of town. Within 3 weeks, he was terminated. The press release, carefully worded, cited ethical violations incompatible with our institutional standards. The Connecticut Medical Board followed. They opened their own investigation and, after several hearings, issued restrictions on James's medical license. He could no longer practice sports medicine within the state. His name, once printed on brochures for elite athletic care, was quietly removed. Within months, he was unemployable in any reputable facility. Rachel's dissent was even more severe. Michael, unwavering in his pursuit of accountability, filed complaints with every regulatory body governing physical therapy in the region. Thanks to his connections in the legal and medical world, the complaints gained traction rapidly. Audits uncovered massive discrepancies in Rachel's practice: fraudulent insurance billing, fictitious treatment logs, and manipulated referral data. It was more than a personal scandal, it was criminal. The insurance fraud alone resulted in a federal indictment. When her sentencing came down, the judge cited systematic abuse of professional authority for personal gain. Rachel was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison. Her practice closed, her credentials were revoked. Michael divorced her immediately, but not out of revenge. He handled the proceedings with grace and dignity, and in a move no one expected, he reached out to me, not to commiserate, not to bond over shared pain, but to express his respect. You held them accountable, he said during our one meeting after the fallout, not with cruelty, but with truth. You didn't just end the deception, you dismantled it, publicly and precisely. I admire that more than I can say. 6 months later, I'm sitting alone in my new penthouse in downtown Hartford. The skyline stretches wide and open before me, glass buildings catching the sunset, the Connecticut River gleaming with amber reflections. My apartment is quiet, every corner designed by me, for me. The furniture isn't shared. The art on the walls is mine. The freedom in that is something I savor daily. I didn't just leave a marriage. I shed a version of myself that tolerated being lied to, that waited for affection, that made room for secrets. I left behind not just James, but the silence I'd accepted, the self doubt, the restraint. Now I speak clearly, I act deliberately, I live freely. And if there's one thing I know with certainty, it's this: when people try to bury the truth, they forget that truth has roots. And eventually, those roots break through the surface. Strong, undeniable, and far more powerful than any lie. Misery often attracts company, but in my case, it also forged something unexpectedly meaningful. Amid the fallout, when the dust settled and the silence stretched wide around me, Michael was the only person who didn't disappear into the awkward quiet of secondhand embarrassment. Unlike mutual friends who couldn't pick a side or colleagues who were afraid of association, he stood beside me, not just in sympathy, but in solidarity. He offered practical support when I was sorting through the complex financial and legal ramifications of the divorce, but more than that, he gave me perspective. Michael had lived through the same humiliation, the same betrayal, the same sickening realization that the person you trusted most had orchestrated your emotional destruction with cold precision. Our connection was born from shared wreckage, but it grew into something deeper. Not romantic, not yet, but deeply human. He helped me understand forgiveness not as weakness, but as power. Forgiveness, he once said, doesn't mean letting them off the hook. It means you stop carrying their garbage on your back. That reframing changed the trajectory of my healing. I stopped letting my anger rot in silence. I began channeling it constructively, intentionally. The divorce itself was almost disappointingly simple. James, now professionally disgraced and financially neutered, had neither the will nor the leverage to contest anything. Connecticut's equitable distribution laws split our assets fairly, but with his future income potential destroyed, I retained the lion's share. Our properties, our investments, even the Rosewood Manor house. I sold the house almost immediately. I didn't want its walls, soaked with carefully disguised lies, to echo around me. I didn't want the ghost of a marriage that had long since died following me into every room. Instead, I used the proceeds to purchase the penthouse I live in now, a sleek, sunlit sanctuary in downtown Hartford. Perched above the din of my former life, here in this clean and quiet space, I began rebuilding not just my personal identity, but my professional legacy. The scandal didn't destroy my career at Pettit and Associates. In a strange twist of poetic justice, it elevated it. The very public nature of the confrontation, the exposure, the evidence, the clarity, created waves across legal and financial circles. Women in similar situations began seeking me out. They didn't want just a lawyer. They wanted someone who understood, someone who had lived it, fought it, and won. We created a new division at the firm, Matrimonial Financial Forensics. It specialized in uncovering hidden assets, tracing secret expenditures, and documenting patterns of infidelity and financial deception in high net worth divorces. And I became its senior partner. What had once been the source of my personal undoing became the cornerstone of my professional renaissance. Ironically, the same analytical acumen that allowed me to ignore the early warning signs in my marriage became the very thing I used to help others face what they feared. I learned to apply my methods with a new intention, not just to dissect fraud, but to affirm truth. I verified emotional authenticity the same way I traced offshore accounts, by studying patterns, behavior, and data. And in doing so, I found real, grounded relationships, friendships forged in clarity, conversations that didn't require performance. I stopped apologizing for being precise, skeptical, or hard to impress. I stopped making space for lies wrapped in charm, and I never lost another case. The woman who walked into that dining room 6 months ago with a silent dossier and a steady hand wasn't a scorned wife. She was a specialist in exposing the arrogant. And Rachel Montgomery had no idea she was attempting to outmaneuver someone whose job it was to destroy people who thought they were too clever to get caught. She learned in the most public and permanent way possible that there are games too dangerous to play with people trained to win. James, too, learned the cost of underestimating me. He believed I was too trusting, too distracted by work, too emotionally restrained to notice the growing inconsistencies in his alibis. But his greatest mistake wasn't the affair, it was the assumption that I would stay silent. The woman he married, the one who never raised her voice, who always let him lead social conversations, who deferred and adapted, was gone, replaced by someone who'd torn down the carefully constructed house of lies, brick by brick, and rebuilt herself in the open air of truth. Now, on Sunday evenings, Michael comes over, we cook together, share updates from work. Sometimes we just sit in quiet companionship with glasses of wine and music playing low in the background. We don't call it dating. We're not ready for that word, but it's honest in a way neither of our marriages ever were. And that honesty feels revolutionary. The view from this penthouse reinforces everything I've come to understand. When I lived in the valley of my marriage, buried under routine, deception, and distraction, I couldn't see what surrounded me. But from up here, I see clearly. I see the past for what it was, not a failure, but a lesson. And I see the future not as something to fear, but something to shape. Tomorrow, I begin work on a new case. A prominent Hartford entrepreneur suspected by his wife of hiding assets offshore and preparing to leave her for a younger coworker. It's a situation that mirrors my own story in unsettling ways. But I don't flinch. These are the cases I'm built for now. I'll follow the trail through spreadsheets, tax records, and private communications and unravel the narrative with professional precision. Because the woman who once specialized in money trails has learned that emotional trails, too, leave footprints. And when you follow them long enough, they lead to the truth. Justice, I've discovered, isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about exposure. Sometimes it's about reclaiming your voice in a room where it was once drowned out by the performance of others. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's about reminding people that truth, when served cold, leaves a mark that no lie can ever cover.